шановні колеги, і дорогі студенти і слухачі. Маю велику честь і шану в цю надзвичайну святкову пору вітати вас, бути з вами і тішитися радісною атмосферою 12-ї річниці незалежності Української держави і початком нового навчального року. Я вірю, що Києво-Могилянська академія та її вплив на молодь, виховання і рівень освіти відіграє велику роль у розбудові і дальші нові процеси української держави і майбутнього української нації. І я вам бажаю всього найкращого на то. А я тепер, вибачте, але мою доповідь мені страшніше по-англійськи говорити. So the question is, what is it that I want to talk about to you? I want to talk about the fact that the future success of technology-based companies and their leaders critically will depend on their ability to innovate, that means accelerate the transformation of new ideas and concepts into successful products or services to satisfy the needs and desires of their internal and external customers. They have to be able to competently manage technology in the global arena, and most importantly, they have to recognize and be fully aware of the fact that the rate of change will continue to increase, that speed has become a major determining factor for success, that the world-class innovation process has become the dominant business process. And for that reason, a persistent sense of urgency has to be established and maintained. That requires paradigm shifts and a change process in order to achieve all of this. Now, why do I think that this is important to you? And I think the answer is very simple. I see you as the future executives and leaders in Ukrainian industry, in Ukrainian academia, and possibly the government. And as such leaders, you must be aware of the environment in which you will be working, so that you will be able to prudently make the decisions that are required of you within your area of responsibility. Now, we have a saying that says the first thing you need to do is you have to tell the people what you want to tell them, then you want to tell them why you want to tell them that, and then you want to tell them why you think you're qualified to tell you that. Now, I'm not going to go into the details because, Madam President, he told you already about me. I have a long experience in this area. So I would like to just begin right now. A study of history clearly shows that the standard of living of groups of people and even of nations was and still is very largely determined by the growth, the migration, the state of health, the skills, the degree of education, and the level of information of the populations. It also depends on the opportunities and constraints that are provided by ethnic, societal, political, international, and the natural environment. They are also determined by the availability of resources, especially scarce resources, by the development and utilization of new technologies. I want to emphasize that as a technologist. But nevertheless, it is also important to have leadership qualities and managerial capabilities of the key individuals. Now, at present, all these economic locomotives are tangled up everywhere in the world in an unprecedented state of change and turbulence. And in order to survive and prosper, nations and corporations must strive to become globally competitive. Now, this is not easy, since the environment in which corporations have to compete today and in the future has dramatically, fundamentally, and permanently changed. And the present sense of urgency, which is called about the situation, is described in the next few graphs. What are all these reasons that cause us to have this urgency? Well, first of all, there's fierce globalization of the technologies, of the markets, of capital, and the competition, and that continues to be rampant Number two is the technology and technology-based innovation, as well as business, societal, environmental, political requirements, and now including homeland security, will remain to be the key drivers of the economic development and growth. But there's also the customer out there, and demand for products and services, and for the variety of those, and mass customization, mass personalization, quality, reliability. All of this is relentlessly increasing. Modern communication media are changing the way the world sees itself. And the internet, as you all know, is turning the business upside down and inside out. It's fundamentally changing the way companies and countries operate, and it provides the connectivity and universal communication tools that launch the new economy, which we call e-commerce. And last but not least, just recently, the world has gone from analog to digital. So any information is now captured, received, stored, processed, manipulated, and transmitted in signals of ones and zeros. And these digital technologies are upending the competitive balance across the corporate spectrum and require a re-examination of the old basic ways in which business has been done so far. Now, in order to survive in this complicated situation, and in order to prosper, grow, and maintain a global competitive edge, nations and corporations must adjust to these, what we call strategic inflection points, and to the process that the Austrian-born economist Josef Schumpeter called creative destruction. They have to become e-enabled and world-class in their business processing. Now, during the 80s and the 90s, the United States, realizing that its competitive edge had deteriorated during the period of 1965 to 1980, experienced what I like to call a quiet perestroika of its industry. This restructuring was brought about by the voluntary involvement of private industry, of academia, of professional societies, of think tanks, as well as by some government initiatives. It resulted in the US's present unique economic power position. And this corporate re-engineering, as it was called very often, was essentially based on the principle of business process optimization. And that's why I picked that as the title of my talk for you today. And what is that? What is that philosophy? It is basically looking at business from a holistic point of view as a set of intertwined, interrelated, and interdependent business processes. And optimizing these processes by reducing and eliminating what we call non-value-added steps. That means steps that simply do not add anything of value to the process, and removing redundant steps and procedures. And last but not least, utilizing new management principles and tools such as what we call time-based management, lean manufacturing, Six Sigma reliability, cross-functional teams, task control management, and so on and so on. Now, in my talk, I will briefly describe and show how the USA during the past 40 years lost and then regained its competitive edge. I will outline the details of the methodology of business process optimization used for this corporate re-engineering, and then I might suggest how Ukraine can become a more competitive global partner by utilizing a similar approach of what the United States did. Let's just, as a background, talk about now why did America have this post-war economic primacy? There were a number of reasons for that. There's basically what we call 7 pillars of the post-war economic primacy. Your parents certainly will remember that, but when I look at you, I think you're all so young that you probably don't remember all of this anymore. After the end of the Second World War, the American market was 8 times larger than the next largest market. 8 times, almost an order of magnitude. Furthermore, because Americans have more discretionary income than others, the first mass market for almost everything was in the USA. And thus the American industry enjoyed essentially economies of scale that no one else could even hope to achieve. Now, in addition to that, the rest of the world, of course, was yearning for American products, since their own destroyed industry could not even satisfy the local market. American technology was superior. World War II had destroyed the industrial infrastructure as well as the scientific establishments in much of the rest of the world. And in addition to that, Europe had given America some of its very best brains. American workers were more skilled on the average than those in other countries, since it had invented mass public elementary and secondary education already early. The US was far richer than other nations, and American industry could afford to do and buy things, make investments that other countries could not do. And last but not least, American managers were the best in the world, because America was the only country in the world where commerce and business management was the only route to the top, the route to success. Now, and partly because of the success of the radiation laboratory at MIT, in its development of radar during the World War II, the research was unrestrictedly being supported by the government and by industry. And this led to the first generation of R&D management, as we call it. That was the generation of hope, basically. And what did they say to the companies? They said, go out and find the smartest people that you can find, smartest scientists, engineers, give them all the money that they want, put them in an isolated, beautiful laboratory somewhere out in the countryside, and leave them alone. Don't manage them and don't check them. And they will come up with the greatest new ideas and products. Okay, now I tried to show all of these periods that I'm talking about in detail in this slide here, where you can see the economic development of the US, where you can see what I call the perestroika activities, R&D management generations, and the beginning and continuation of globalization. Now, let's talk again about this economic primacy. It only lasted until about 1960, so about 15 years. And then, during that period from 1965 to about 1980, the US productivity and its competitive edge continuously deteriorated due to a number of causes. I'd like to discuss those causes. First, of course, there was a constantly increasing aggressive foreign competition. What that basically means, the rest of the world was not sleeping. They were envious, and they were working very hard to try to be equal. The second one was complacency. I tried to find out what would be a good Ukrainian word for complacency. Samo dopovolenia and all kind of others. They all really don't say exactly what complacency means. Namely, a feeling of quiet pleasure or security and satisfaction about how well you have done, but not being aware that there's some potential danger or defect or something like that out there. And America was complacent. They felt that forever and forever they would have economic supremacy. Then there were other things, a failure to address problems such as outdated managerial strategies, short business horizons, technological weaknesses in the R&D and production, neglect of the human resources, and so on and so on. I don't want to go into these things because the lecture would just take far too long, but since I'm a technical person, let me just mention something about the managerial strategy. They were outdated because the set of principles which shaped the structure, the management, and performance of American business and made them the envy of the world for the past 2 centuries, all of a sudden were obsolete and outdated. The companies that were created to thrive on mass production and on stability and on growth, they could not succeed anymore in a world where customers, competition, and change demanded ultimate flexibility and quick response. These companies were all like the Titanic. They couldn't see that there was an iceberg that was coming. So corporations, for example, had to shorten their response time to the customer's needs and requests, and they had to exploit their fast response time to capture additional business. The answer to all of that was and still is what we call corporate agility, the path to change and competitiveness. So what happened in America? Let's talk about this quiet perestroika. Around 1980, what we call the wake-up call came. And America gradually underwent what I call this quiet perestroika because it began to utilize, and especially in manufacturing, new management principles and tools such as time-based management, restructuring, re-engineering, re-strategizing, lean production, Six Sigma reliability, zero defects from the Japanese. We learned Kaizen, and then later on in 1991, the American Academy of Engineering also defined what we mean by world class. There's many others that I do not want to go into. This quiet perestroika, and this is very important, it was neither initiated nor imposed by the government. It was not imposed by the government. Industry itself realized that they had to do something. So it was mostly a private initiative from individuals, from companies, from the industry as a whole, from professional societies, from the think tanks, and from consultants. And there were just some government initiatives. So, in '65 there was the awareness throughout the industry that one had to design for manufacturability. You could not design things anymore and then just ask the engineer and say, make it, and they said, well, you're crazy because we cannot make that. So the design had to include already manufacturability. It was later moved to include not only manufacturability, but also long-term quality, environmental friendliness, serviceability, ergonomic things, and so on. Michael Porter, which is a professor at the Harvard Business School, wrote in 1980 a book called Competitive Strategy, which was very popular and people read that. And Tom Peters, an independent consultant, wrote in 1982 a book called In Search of Excellence, which I think was a title that described exactly what the industry was striving for. They were looking and trying to figure out how can we be excellent again, because they saw that things were going down. In 1984, President Reagan formed a presidential commission under John Young, which was the president and CEO of Hewlett-Packard, to investigate the new reality of what they called global competition. The word global became more and more popular during that time. The global competition that was faced by the American industry, both at home and abroad, and requested recommendations on ways of improving the nation's ability to compete. The specific and very detailed recommendations of this Young report on globalization can be summarized in 4 very simple areas. Area number 1, create, apply, and protect technological innovations. Number 2, reduce the cost of capital to the American industry. Number 3, develop more skilled, flexible, and motivated workforce. And number 4, make the international trade a national priority. At the same time, the National Academy of Engineering, also on their own initiative and not by government instructions, began studies that led to many reports and symposia in the area of national interest in an age of global technology, and especially the definition and the detailed description of what we mean by world-class manufacturing systems. In 1988, Michael Dutousos, which is a professor at MIT, wrote a book which was also a bestseller. It's called Made in America, Regaining the Productive Edge. This was again basically an instruction book for American industry on how to improve again. And last but not least, in 1993, Michael Hammer, which was also a private consultant, wrote the book called Re-engineering the Corporation. And almost every major organization in the United States read this book and started reorganizing. The problem actually with that one was that people over-reorganized and over-re-engineered, and so many companies actually did not become as successful as they had hoped to do that. Nevertheless, all of these worked very well, and the ones that I mentioned were just the landmarks in the recovery of the competitive edge. So, now in the mid-1990s, mostly due to this perestroika, the United States experienced an unprecedented upsurge in economic productivity. Unbelievable. Furthermore, the rapid technological changes in communications, computing, and information management continued apace and also helped along. At the same time, however, it became clear that other problems were looming at the horizon, which were threatening the continued economic advances. There might be a need for another perestroika in the United States, because the problems that we have right now are the inadequacy of a lower and middle school system, We had the bursting of what we call the dot-com bubble. We have an approaching economic slowdown and perhaps a recession now. Corruption and breakdown of ethics in corporate governance, I'm sure you read about those. We have worldwide terrorism, including cyber terrorism. And last but not least, we have the intractable Middle East situation. This indicates, as I said, there might be a need for a second perestroika and renewed economic restructuring. So this is now a look at the US. Why did I do this? Just to show you that we had problems and we tried to overcome the problems by looking at them, trying to figure out what to do. Now, where's Ukraine today? I will not bore you here with a lot of economic figures like successive and impressive growth domestic products of 6%, 9%, 4.8%, perhaps this year on a path of 7%. I don't want to talk about the problems with the grain harvest that we have, that you have this year. And I don't want to get into any kind of political discussions either. As a matter of fact, I simply refer you to the comments made by the former US ambassador to Ukraine, Carlos Pascual, in his farewell speech that he gave here in July. And he clearly pointed out that despite the many advances that have been made, Ukraine has to continue to work towards improving at least 4 different areas, namely the rule of law, the quality of Ukraine's democracy, integration with the Euro-Atlantic community, and market economics. Now, since my discussions about business process optimization for global competitiveness, which is clearly a topic that falls within market economics, I just want to mention a few specific points here and not go into any of the others. So allow me to just make those points. First, Ukraine needs to be cognizant of its competition. The capital, the money, goes where it makes the greatest profit in the shortest time and where it has to work the least in order to get that profit. It's a very simple rule, but one should remind himself every day of that. So you have to figure out how can you make Ukraine so attractive that the people want to put their capital into Ukraine. Second, the rule of law has to overcome the rule of power, and so there has to be a predictability in the court system which has to be established. Otherwise, foreign corporations are afraid to make major investments in Ukraine. The laws and the regulations that bring Ukraine into compliance with the World Trade Organization protocol, they have to be put in place. Otherwise, the world is afraid to trade with Ukraine. Okay. Now, Ukraine is a country of 50 million people with tremendous human resources. I'm impressed with the educated population and a good labor force. You have a competitive missile technology, and you also have some good high technology capabilities. You have certainly some of the best agricultural land in the world. You have a strategic location, and you have also access to regional markets. And eventually, in this global village in which we are living, these resources will be recognized and will be exploited to the advantage of groups, both internationally and hopefully domestically in Ukraine. The question here is only how quickly. And last but least, the Ukrainian industry has to undertake a restructuring or a perestroika of its business processes all by its own in order to become globally competitive. And a successful transition in all of these areas is certainly a long-term, a generational process. Presently, it is obvious that it is unfinished and more needs to be done, but it is also important that everybody here understands these principles, because we can only be a friend to Ukraine if we can speak honestly about what we believe in. And now, as a challenge, I ask all of you to contemplate what role should be played by Ukrainian industry, by Ukrainian academia, by the government, by your professional organizations, by your think tanks, and by you as individuals in this transitional period. What role should you play? I'm not going to ask for the answers right now, but if you have some good ideas, please put them into action. Okay, so now let's talk about the principle of business process optimization, because that is certainly one thing that needs to be done. In the mid-80s, it became very clear that the modern corporation cannot be competitive if it simply operates as a loosely coalesced group of independent functional units whose identity depends on one specific discipline. Another more holistic view was required for future competitiveness. And such a holistic view of business is to look at the enterprise, at the corporation, as a set of interdependent, intertwined, and interrelated business processes. A process in turn, of course, is a set of interrelated activities, some taking place concurrently and some consecutively, that, when taken together, convert an input to an output. Very simple. And Professor Edward Deming said that if you cannot describe what you are doing as a process, you simply do not know what you're doing. So process description is very, very important. The key processes, which are shown together here in this view graph, are innovation and product design development, a fulfillment process, which means basically manufacturing and delivering to the customer, a strategy planning process, and of course the top management process. The top management process encompasses the judicious use of means to accomplish an end. It is comprised of several components, and the collective sum of these components dictates the culture of the company. And it is important to note here that the change process, which is acting on the top management process, causes the corporate cultural changes that are required at every level for becoming world-class. So the problem that industries around the world have to address immediately is the fact that most companies still operate functionally and tend to optimize these functions by applying resources to disjointed problem solving. That they have strong functions and product ownership, but do not have a process ownership. That they have walls and miles and distances between the functions and concrete floors between organizational levels. In order for these companies to become responsive, competitive, innovative, efficient, customer-focused, and profitable, they need to operate with a set of seamlessly interconnected processes that transcend the functional silo barriers. What we need is a new method of interconnected processes, and then of course we work with time-based management principles in order to reduce the cycle time and optimize the process to make it shorter. Next to the process view comes the consideration of time as a source of competitive advantage. Today, time is the cutting edge. It is a strategic weapon, and as such, time is the equivalent of money, of productivity, of quality, and so on. Now, why is time of such importance? As you can see in the next slide, time has a number of very unique characteristics. First of all, time is the only non-renewable and non-manipulable resource that a company has. It cannot be bought, it cannot be reversed. This is a very, very important thing, because with all other indicators and measures that a corporation can use, if you do, for instance, finances, and you have a very, very smart financial officer that is very creative, he can come up with almost any numbers that you ask him to come up with. But there's no one yet that has invented how to recover lost time or how to turn the time backwards. So this is a very, very important measure in a corporate process. Now, time is a driver for everything in the workplace and for most things in the marketplace. Most companies have enormous opportunities to improve operating results by focusing on the effects of process cycle time improvement. And it turns out that there's an extremely strong relationship between the process cycle time of a corporation and how an organization learns and improves. Now, in addition to the process view on time-based management, there are a number of other requirements for attaining global competitiveness. We call these critical success factors. They are those requirements that have to be met to assure success. There's a number of them, and it's obvious that I cannot, during this limited time, go through in detail for each one of these factors. Obviously, of course, it starts out with leadership. There's no question about it that a leadership which is visibly exhibited throughout the organization is very important. It can generate this persistent sense of urgency that I talked about, which really just means that there's no complacency. It can motivate the people for continuous improvement. In addition to that, of course, it gives the corporate vision and strategy and goals and so on, which is very, very important. You need a board of directors with vision, corporate ethics, and so on. But more important here really right now is that I'd like to mention at least one of these items specifically, and that is the definition of empowerment, because this is very useful since Ukraine has for a long time been working on the situation of central control. And I think I don't need to talk about that. Empowerment is a state that exists when the people, teams, or groups have been provided with a clear statement of their roles, responsibilities, and accountability. They know what they have to do, what they have to achieve. Where they have been given clear objectives, goals, and parameters within which they can work, cannot have total freedom. Where they have been given formal authority to accomplish this task, where they are free to identify and execute solutions to the problem without having to check constantly on whether this is okay or not. And most importantly, where they accept the right, the risk, and the responsibility to fail a little bit, perhaps often, to gain many cycles of learning, many experiences. And last but not least, I must emphasize the importance of proper metrics or measurements within all the processes that we talk about. So let me quote Lord Kelvin here right now, who already in the last century said, when you can measure what you're speaking about and express it in numbers, then you know something about it. But when you cannot measure it, when you cannot express it in numbers, your knowledge is of a meager and unsatisfactory kind. Translated into practical American, this means if you can't measure what you're doing, you don't know what you're doing. So having realized the importance of metrics, the question of course is what kind of metrics and how many do we need? The characteristics of good metrics are shown in the next slide. They have to improve as the underlying process improves. They worsen as the underlying process worsens. They should be meaningful to the business. They should be applied consistently for similar situations. They should drive correct behavior, deliver justifiable benefit, and benefit the customers and make the company more competitive. Now I'm going to move on a little bit because the time is getting short. So let me just say that all business processes have certain measures or metrics that when they are used as a focus in a corporate effort for improvement, they will lead to positive enhancement in the performance, especially of the processes. And these are called drivers. We call these measurements drivers. But management is, of course, also interested in a number of metrics that relate to the state of the companies as a whole, and they are meaningful to the stakeholders of the corporation. And these we call results or key business performance indicators. They're often financial in nature, like sales, profit, market share, productivity, customer satisfaction, return on investment, and so on and so on. The important thing is that drivers link to results, and driver measurements are actually leading indicators of results. And so improving a driver generally creates the opportunity for subsequent improvement of results. There are a number of critical process drivers, and you should not be surprised that time is the most important one of these. And how do we measure time? Well, we measure it as cycle time, and there are various ways in which we can do that, static or dynamic, and I'm not going to go into that. In order to avoid that you just work faster but not accurate, or as we call sloppy, we also make a measurement which we call first pass yield, which is just a measurement that tells you on how many things you have done correct the first time you've tried to do them. And other measures are, of course, productivity, cost, and on-time delivery, which is very, very important for customers. All four driver metrics are generally required for processes to provide a balanced improvement. Time is the most precious of all resources. And as I mentioned before, it is non-reversible, non-recoverable, and non-manipulable. Now, all this sounds very reasonable and simple. And the question is, why is it so difficult to implement all these methodologies? What gets into the way of optimizing business processes according to those principles that I have just mentioned? Well, the answer, I'll show it in the next slide, is constraints and barriers, things that stop us from doing and what we really ought to be doing. Now, this picture just shows really what a barrier is, and we actually categorize barriers into three classes, namely subject matter barriers, business process barriers, and cultural barriers. Now, the subject matter barriers are things that you simply don't know about the process that you're working in. There could be some scientific problems, unique expertise, knowledge of a customer, of a technology, specific knowledge of the market, and so on. In general, consultants don't help on that because the employees of the corporation should be able to figure these things out by themselves. Now, the next one are business processes, and that has something to do with resources, strategic alignment, data, project starting discipline, and so on. They are more difficult to remove, but once you remove them, their impact in improving the process is much, much higher than that of subject matters. And the last ones are cultural barriers. They are habits, customs, established ways of how things are being done, like no proper measurements, like no controls, not proper incentives, a poor resource allocation, a lack of data integrity, lack of accountability, lack of leadership, all these things that I mentioned before as critical success factors. Now, they are the most difficult ones to remove, but once you remove those, they have an absolutely super impact on the improvement of your competitiveness. And therefore, removal of all these constraints and barriers, especially the cultural barriers, with their non-value added steps, is a major component of process optimization. It is the most difficult part, and it requires a top management support together with root cause analysis, discipline, perseverance, and a dedication. Now, I mentioned a number of times what is world-class, because industry corporations should become world-class companies. So let's talk about quickly, what do we mean by world-class? Now, as I mentioned, the National Academy of Engineering did a large study for about 2 years in 1991. They finally defined what this means. And they published their findings in a book which every corporate executive read and tried to implement. So what do we mean by world-class? World-class is basically when a company is striving to be the best of the best and or using best practices. Of course, what does best of the best mean and what does best practices mean? One has to go into detail on these things. They have to adopt a system or a process view, which is what I talked about before. Not the functional view, but a process view. They have to persist in continuous improvement. No complacency ever again. And they have to recognize, understand, and adopt a core set of generic, universally acceptable operating principles, which they call the foundations. And these foundations must be viewed as a system of action-oriented, interrelated principles whose collective application can produce important improvements within this manufacturing enterprise. And these operational principles must be recognized and understood and aggressively adopted by the organization that aspires to become world-class. These operating principles, there's 10 of them, and we cannot study every one of them. But experience in the last 10 years has shown that even though these 10 operating principles or foundations that were defined for manufacturing systems, that these foundations are so generic in that they are not specific to a particular industry or a company. They are universal in that they can be applied in a wide variety of circumstances. They are operational in that they lead to specific actions and show directions that should be taken. It's like a vade-mecum. It's like a book that tells you step by step on what you have to do in order to become world-class. The main foundation of these 10 foundations shown in the next slide. World-class companies have established as an operating goal that they will be world-class. In other words, they just tell themselves, we're going to be world-class, that's it. They assess their performance by periodically benchmarking themselves against the competition, against other companies. They use the information gained by benchmarking to establish their own goals and objectives, which they communicate to all members of the enterprise. They continuously measure and assess the performance of the system against these objectives. And they regularly assess the appropriateness of the objectives to attaining world-class status. Now, I have the slides here of all 10 of them, but I'm not going to go into those things here right now, because that would take too long again. But as you can see, they're talking about objectives and goals, about the customer, about the organization, about the employees, about vendors, about management tasks, all the things that I have talked about before already. Metrics, learning, experimenting, and technology. So in order to optimize the business processes and become globally competitive, the existing constraints and barriers have to be systematically removed, and the 10 foundations of world class have to be implemented. This requires shifting paradigms and significant mind changes. It is basically, as we always say, a little bit like trying to go on a diet and lose weight. The prescription for losing weight is very simple. You limit the intake of the calories and you increase the rate at which you burn the calories. So you eat less and do a lot of exercises. Now we all know this and it's very simple. How come many people still carry too much weight around? The answer for that is very simple, that the implementation of a simple but powerful rule is a difficult thing. So this requires a change, and that change within corporations can be achieved by installing and enforcing a change process. Now I've shown a change process here, which I personally like. There are many other prescriptions for change processes, but Professor John Cotter from the Harvard Business School is a well-known authority in that area. And he basically talks about an 8-stage change process, which of course mentions many of the things that I have mentioned already to you right now. You establish, first of all, a sense of urgency. And again, what do we mean by that? We've got to get rid of complacency. We have to say to ourselves, things aren't the way they ought to be, and we have to change. We have to change for the better. The next thing is you form the team that will help you to do that. Now, in addition, of course, to forming a team, you have to have the vision, the leadership that tells the people on what they really have to do. The goals have to be communicated, and this whole change vision has to be communicated. You have to give empowerment to the people so that they can go out and do the kind of things that we want them to do. A good idea from a psychological point of view, of course, is generating short-term wins. That means try to have a couple of projects where you know you can get success very quickly, because once you have some success, you just start feeling better right away. And last but not least, when you have established all these changes, you have to anchor these new approaches in the culture of the corporation. Otherwise, they will go away. So this is a very broad overview of how you have to go about trying to optimize business processes in industry in order to gain a competitive edge. And so in conclusion again, what would I say, what is the message that you can take away for Ukraine? And I'm only making comments, I'm not telling you that you should do that. In my estimation, what should be done? What should industry do? Industry should learn and implement the principles of world class and of change management. They have to learn that. What should academia do? Academia should develop courses and teach the principles of global technology management. Well, what should the government do? I mentioned that before. Establish the rule of law, establish predictability in the court system, make the changes in the legal structure and in the regulatory structure that are required to put in place the laws and regulations that will bring Ukraine in compliance with the World Trade Organization protocol. Also work towards a legal framework that will allow Ukrainian inventions to be patented in other countries. And for individuals, I'm suggesting, try to do your part in establishing competitive. So, дякую за те, що я міг поділитися з вами моїми думками. Я дякую за вашу увагу. Я бажаю вам всього найкращого на вашій праці.
Thank you very much, Professor Цайнінгер, and remain on your place. Any question?
You mentioned that the United States is facing a second perestroika.
Yeah, it might, yeah.
In light
They
of
haven't
that,
listened to me yet, but they might. Yeah.
in light of that observation, Ukraine has an opportunity to perhaps leapfrog some of those problems. My comment and question is, how can Ukraine perhaps leapfrog the phase of corporate responsibility, and what sort of checks are needed on business today so that Ukraine perhaps doesn't experience situations such as Enron, etc.?
Okay, well, you picked the right company. You know, that's what I was referring to without trying to talk about Enron. This whole topic is one that we call corporate governance. And the question is, you know, what should be the rules of corporate governance? Obviously, there's two of them, right? Well, I think my answer to you is that keep reading what's happening in the United States, because this is a hot topic right now. They're trying to change this whole thing because there was too much insider dealing. There were too many conflicts of interest between the financial people and what we call just the regular management. There were things going on that management should have known. There are other things where management told the financial people to do things that they should not have been doing, and so on. If you watch what's happening there right now, you probably will not make the same mistakes. But what you need for larger corporations, you need a board of directors. And my suggestion always is to follow the German principle. They actually have two boards. They have a management board, which is responsible for the day-to-day management of the corporation. And then they have what they call a supervisory board, which consists of people from the outside world, people that do not have the same kind of interest in this day-to-day decisions because they don't profit from those. So these are people that will watch out for the overall health and honesty of a corporation. You know, we could talk a long time about that, but I think corporate governance is something that you want to watch out for.
Is there a role of governments, perhaps, in the rule of law to...
Absolutely. Yeah.
Is there an example that we can follow?
Yeah, I don't know any specific example right now, but there's certainly, you know, the Federal Communication Commission in the United States is constantly looking at the problems of the communication, FCIC, I think. They are looking at insider trading problems, and they're establishing new laws and regulations on how to avoid all these things. Now, obviously, this is an ongoing process. I think what you need to do is just keep following the headlines in the United States, and you will find out what's going on. Because no matter how many rules you make, there will always be smart people that will find a loophole to get around. But corporate governance is one thing. Government as such, yeah, I think if they just keep focusing on establishing the rule of law overall, including themselves, then you benefit a lot from that.
Professor Цайнінгер, you mentioned and you talked a lot about being world-class, the need of being world-class, the need of raising competitiveness for Ukrainian companies, for global companies. What are the implications, to your mind, for global business education in general and Ukrainian business education in particular?
Well, let me take first what I think about the business education globally. There has been too much emphasis on Harvard. You know, it was at one point that if you had an MBA from Harvard, you were king and you could go everywhere. But it turned out now that not all of these Harvard principles that were developed have actually led to corporate success. And so there's a lot of rethinking that is going on right now. This is how I see on how they change. Now, as for business education in Ukraine, I have to say that on the one hand, I'm extremely pleased to see already what you people are doing here. I mean, I don't have to express very much to say that the faculty and the student body that you have here is very impressive. I mean, I look upon you as the future elite of Ukrainian industry. Now, this is nice on the one hand, but on the other hand, of course, comes with an obligation. As the French used to say, noblesse oblige. You have an obligation to make sure that you help Ukraine to become an equal competitive partner in the world. Now, what you're doing is you're bringing, I mean your school, you're bringing these people up to a world-class standard, as far as I'm concerned. And there, all you can do is just continue to do it, make sure that the smartest people that are here in Ukraine don't just want to go to Harvard or to Wharton School or to, well, all the other good schools. But they should say, well, Mohila Academy has a business school that's as good as any as the others, and we do it right here, and we stay here in Ukraine. We contribute in Ukraine. I don't know whether this answers your question. I don't have any specific recommendations other than, make sure that you have an open horizon and you see what all the other business schools are doing. I go on the internet and I just pull down all the curricula from the various business schools to take a look and see what topics they handle and make sure that I'm familiar with most of them.
You have just told us about some foundations of a high industrialized and successful country. Well, and how do you think? Is it possible for Ukraine to use these foundations to be one of the most successful states in the world?
Yeah, now I repeat the question just to make sure I got it right. The question is it okay for Ukraine to follow successful other nations?
Not nations, as states. For example, as USA. You told us foundations of the success of the USA.
Yeah.
Well, and can we use these foundations to be successful as USA?
Well, I personally would say that if you follow the 10 foundations of the world-class definition, that your companies in Ukraine will become world-class.
For example, we must have a high level of industrialization, and we have to have a high level of education to be successful. Or what must we do? I want to have an answer to have my way.
Well, what you have to do, if I understand you correctly, first of all of you that are here, and I assume there's a whole number of you that are here now, that's your first year. Somebody told you yesterday, that you picked a tough road to follow. That's true. But without working very hard and going along a tough road, you're not going to get anywhere. And I think my recommendation to you is take your studies here at the Mohila Academy very, very seriously. And that will already help you personally, and that will help Ukraine later on, because you will become a member of the Ukrainian industry or academia or government. My recommendation, which I had here, but time was running out, I had a recommendation, of course, for professional societies and for the Academy of Engineering of Ukraine. I suggest that what they ought to do is to actually have the book on world-class manufacturing translated into Ukrainian and distributed to all the CEOs of the whole industry in Ukraine so that they can start reading it and start to apply some of these principles.
We talk about process which have placed in business, world economic, but we don't talk about people. As people are a dawn of all processes which have placed in the world. I want to ask about Lee Iacocca.
Lee Iacocca?
Lee Iacocca, yeah. Is he concerned to your theory?
Well, when he took over Chrysler, he was very successful, I guess, at Ford Motor Company, but they were still working pretty much on the old business principles. Ford is sort of a typical company of the old principle, namely mass production, no flexibility, totally vertically integrated type things and so on. But the new world, of course, requires flexibility. So the Ford used to say you can buy any color Ford as long as it is black. and people don't like this anymore today. Okay, so when Iacocca went to Chrysler, which was already in very bad shape, he started implementing some of these principles. They weren't all established yet at that time, but he certainly implemented what we call time-based management. What else can I tell you about Mr. Iacocca? He was very successful until he retired. But there are other people like Jack Welch from General Electric, which followed the same principle. That's why I put, as a first slide, I put the quotation from him up, where he says, if the rate of change outside is larger than the rate of change inside, the end is near. And so every corporation ought to work on making sure, first of all, measure what the rate of change is on the outside, and then make sure that the rate of change on the inside of your corporation is faster than that on the outside.
На початку своєї промови ви сказали, що американські працівники були після війни...
Тільки не так скоро говорити.
Ви сказали, що в післявоєнний період американські працівники були найліпшими в світі.
Так.
Можна знати, за яким чином це було встановлено, і які працівники саме яких сфер діяльності внесли найбільший внесок до економіки?
Yeah, well, that's an interesting question. Let me answer that one in two parts. Number one is, of course, why do we say that they were the best workers in the world? That is only on the basis of their education. Okay, America invented very early, or implemented a broad-based education of the people, whereas in Europe, you normally would just go to grade school for 8 years and then you would go and just learn a trade or something like that. And only very few people would go up to a gymnasium or what they call high school in America. Well, in America, because that is a land of immigrants, all these immigrants, they all said, well, my children will get a better education than what I had. And so they started very early to introduce the requirement that children would have to finish a high school all the way through. Now, of course, at this point, is that everyone needs to finish a college. And that means that they were better educated, broader educated. It does not necessarily mean that they have better skills, because you learn the skills when you go into a trade school, for instance. But overall, they had a better background and better education, based on the fact that they finished the high school. The problem is, as a population grows and you have so many people and you want them all to put through a high school, all of you that know about the bell curve of distribution, not everyone has the same amount of intelligence and so on. You have to lower your standards in order to get everyone through. And so this measure that they're better educated or not, if that one is based only on the fact that they have a high school degree, is not good anymore. And if you listen to what I was saying before, this is one of the key questions that we have now when we ask, is the United States a nation at risk? And that is exactly the school system that we're talking about. They need to revamp the school system. But after the Second World War, it was relatively good. Now, what specific measures you put on there, that's very, very difficult, because people work in different areas. And people also resist being measured. You know, no one likes to be measured. So this is a very complicated process.
You said that after Second World War, United States of America had a great start. It gave credits and its economical level raised very quickly. So my question is, if there were no war, would America be such a great country, or it would be just an average?
If there hadn't been a great war?
Yes. Well, I mean, it had a good start in its economy after war. So do you think a good start is a great future?
It had a tremendous advantage after the Second World War, because the rest of the world was destroyed, as I said, right? What would have happened if there hadn't been a war? It's very difficult to say, of course, you know, but I can guess. Let's say on the basis of the history of the United States. The United States was only 200 and something years old, okay? And even before the Second World War, it had become basically the leading economic nation in the world already. There is something about America, and of course, being an immigrant myself, I always give all the credit to the immigrants. I say, you know, there's always new blood that is coming in all the time, new ideas, new knowledge, and tremendous enthusiasm, because all the immigrants that come into the United States, they all work very hard to strive to become better, you know, healthier, wealthier, wiser, whatever. And so this is a process that other countries really in the world don't have. I don't know of any other country, except perhaps Australia, that has the same type of an attitude, that it is driven by immigrants. And so I presume that even if there was no World War II, that the United States would have been the leading country in the world. But maybe not as quickly, maybe not quite that high, because there were, as I mentioned, a number of factors, like all the smart engineers from Germany came to America. They didn't stay in Germany, okay? So that helped. If they had stayed in Germany, might have been altogether different. So in hindsight, to reconstruct all of this is very difficult. But I think that they had a head start because it just was a different country. It was a country that was built on this pioneering spirit to just conquer and be good and so on.
I see. I may be mistaken, but to my mind, nowadays Ukrainian economy is a country of chaos. Why? Because prices are regulated by no one, and living standards of people are very little. Is it real market, and what should be done by government in this situation? Thank you.
Yeah, I normally, before I talk, I will always tell the people, by education, I'm a scientist and engineer, and by experience, I'm a manager and consultant. I'm not an economist and I'm not a politician. And your question requires a politician and an economist to answer that one. So the way that I'm going to answer it to you is that as far as the market is concerned, I don't know really how you have to change the market. The market needs to be a free market, not a centrally controlled market. This is number one, the whole market economy. Number two is, I recommend to every corporation to follow some of the principles that I outlined, and I can guarantee you that the corporations, the companies, would be more successful and would become more competitive.
Well, dear Mr. Cayninger, the modern world has definitely become a world of high-tech and information. And the flow of information is so fast and so broad, there is barely some time left for taking decision, actually for business project management. So what would you suggest for limiting the flow of information? Thank you.
Well, there's no way to slow down the flow of information. I mean, this is the law of physics, I guess, or whatever.
What I mean is that business leaders are sometimes watching channels and filtering that information for hours. And, well, information is flooding the world, and a very small percentage of it is really useful. Don't you think so? Yeah,
I agree with you on that one. As a matter of fact, I wouldn't say that there's so much information flowing around. I think what we have is data overload. I mean, there's a lot of data. But you know, there's this pyramid that you start out with data, and if you finally analyze the data and you understand it, there might be some information there. And if you then work with a lot of information, you might actually get some knowledge and some wisdom out of this whole thing. And I think this is certainly one approach, because the data overload, you know, people have already computer programs where they just don't accept all the data anymore because they can't work with it. So you put filters in there. And I think you have to put filters into everything that you do, just make sure you have the right filters so that you get the right information that you need. In terms of making changes quickly, you know, I think back here again to Jack Welch, who was very, very successful with a very simple business decision, which didn't have to be made instantaneously. He said, let's look at our business, and if we are not either number one or number two in the world in this business, let's sell it or improve it so that we are number one and number two. You don't need to make that decision in split seconds. You have time to do that. So when you say business decisions that have to be made very quickly, what kinds are you talking about?
Well,
new products?
Yeah, mainly you need information on the market, on people's needs to take decisions. So collecting and processing information actually takes a lot of time.
Right.
That was my question.
Well, one of the ways that we have found out with some companies is that you give each marketing or each salesperson, you give them a personal computer and make sure that they have access to the internet wherever they are. So basically become e-enabled, as we call it. Because then, as they are out there talking to the customer, they can already send back the information either to the design people, to the engineers, to the cost accounting people, so they could come out with costs and everything while they are there. So this speeds up the process, whereas before, you know, they would write down on a piece of paper, and they would come on Friday, they would come into the office and then finally download everything. How else? Difficult to say. Right? You've got to have constant communication with all your partners in this total collaboration. And all the partners are, of course, your internal customers, your external customers, your suppliers, the financial community, the people that give you money, the people that buy your shares, and so on. You have to have a constant communication. So the communications process obviously is extremely important and has become very complicated because communication is much, much faster.
Mr. Cayninger, how can we increase the general level of living standard? Because, you know, you said in order for business to become a world class, you have to have a strong government to get a help from it. But when you said about United States from the 50s, it already had a strong government, and that's why they had high level of living standards. But in Ukraine, we don't have that kind of situation because people get profit from the law. As you have said, we need a strong law. But why do people in the United States, they don't need to break it because they already have a high living standard. So what can we do in Ukraine in order to get it a level higher? Can you tell me, please?
Okay, well, I have to tell you again, I'm not a politician, so I'm very careful when I make comments about politics. I don't remember that I said that in order to be extremely successful, you need a strong government. In order for a corporation to be successful, they would need a good, honest corporate governance. As far as the government itself is concerned, I think if the government just makes sure that the law is predictable and that there is the rule of law, that's all you need. So in order to raise the standard of living, you've got to get your economy in shape. You've got to make sure that all the people have work, that they're all productive, you know, that the gross domestic product is high, that you don't import too much, but you rather export and make good money on those things. Raising the standard of living does not come overnight, but it also does not come with an ukaz from the government. You know, it's just, it would be so easy for the government to just write something and say, as of tomorrow, our standard of living will be 10% better. Well, it doesn't work that way. You know, the standard of living is part of the resources that are available, whether it's human resources or other resources. It depends on the amount of capital that's available. So thereby, the way the government could help. One of the points that I had made earlier, I said that capital goes where it can make the fastest profit in the shortest time without working too hard. Ukraine needs to generate an environment like that where people would say, hey, this is a great place for me to put my money. Whereas I remember 10 years ago, people were very afraid to invest because the predictability of court systems was not very good at all, and people were afraid that if they put the money in, they might not ever get it back out. It's not, I mean, this is a difficult question. It's not simple to just overnight increase the standard of living. But again, as a consultant in the area of technology, I come back again to the one advice that I can give, which I know works, is okay, get the industry in shape. Make sure that the industry becomes world-class. Follow these 10 foundations of world-class and implement the kind of rules as time-based management and many of these other things that I had mentioned. And you will see that within a relatively short time, the industry will get very good. I mean, I have watched this perestroika in America. We started somewhere around 1980 with this time-based management. And like within 5 to 7 years, we saw tremendous changes. And it was very quiet too. That's why I call it quiet perestroika, because they didn't make a lot of fuss about it. They just did it.
I have a question about business education in Ukraine, and how do you evaluate it, and what could be improved so we, the young generation of Ukraine, would bring our country to the level of highly developed? What is the future of our business education?
You're putting me on the spot here, you know, because if I start criticizing, they might not ask me to come back anymore. Well, what is the status of the business education? I can only judge from what I see here at the Mohela Academy. And I like what I see. I said this a couple of times already. I was very impressed the last time I was here when we taught the course the first time. I was impressed by the enthusiasm that all the students showed in terms of listening to what I was saying. I was impressed by the knowledge of English that they have. I was also impressed, by the way, about their feeling about Ukraine itself, despite the fact that some of them did not speak a lot of Ukrainian, but that will come as time goes on. I think I have to say the same thing as what I said to Mr. Sheremetyev before. Just keep looking at what the world is doing. Yeah? Don't live in an isolated situation. See what's happening out there in the world, because in America, we are right now in a constant change. Everything is changing all the time. And that, in a way, was also part of my message, that it's change. The only thing that we can promise is change. Everything else, who knows? Okay, so you've got to be constantly on the lookout on what is changing. Now, how can you improve the business education? I get myself into some trouble all the time when I say that the first foreign language that you ought to learn is learn good business English. But I still stick to that, you know. I mean, you can learn other languages for cultural reasons, for making friends with other people in Europe and so on. But the rest of the world, the rest of the business world speaks English. So learning English and be very comfortable with English is very important. And the other thing is, you know, take those courses that you're taking at KMBS, take them seriously. How else can you learn? The only way you can measure, of course, whether this is good or not is when you go out into industry and you implement some of these things that we're talking about, and you see that the economic indicators and the results of the corporation that you're working in are improving, then you know you're doing the right thing.
Thank you very much, and really fast, second question. You have so many experiences, first of all, in teaching in Princeton and consulting. Will you have an opportunity to see you again?
If you ask me to come back, I will come back.
Sure, I do. Thank you.
Диплом, який засвідчує, що ця мантія не для параду, а те, що вона належить справжньому професору Києво-Могилянського.